Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. The Boer War, The Struggle for South African Sovereignty, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, Origins of Conflict. In order to understand the Boer War, it's important to understand the political and economic tensions that led to its outbreak. These tensions were rooted in the history of South Africa and the clash between British imperial interests and Boer nationalism. At the heart of the conflict was the discovery of gold and diamonds in South Africa. In the late 1800s, these resources drew an influx of European settlers, including both British and Boer. The British, who had been present in South Africa since the early 1800s, had long been interested in securing control of the region's mineral wealth. The Boers, who were descended from Dutch settlers and spoke a variant of Dutch known as Afrikaans, had established two independent republics in the interior of South Africa, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The first major point of tension between the British and the Boers was the annexation of the Transvaal by the British in 1877. The Boers, who had fought a long and bitter war against the British in the 1830s and 1840s, resented this move and began to chafe under British rule. The situation was exacerbated by the discovery of gold in the Transvaal in the 1880s, which brought a flood of British and other foreign prospectors into the region. In 1884, the Boers established a new republic in the Transvaal, which they called the South African Republic. However, the British continued to exert influence over the region, and tensions between the two sides simmered throughout the 1890s. Another point of tension was the issue of voting rights. The Boer republics had a system of limited franchise, which meant that only white male property owners could vote. The British, who were more accustomed to a broader system of suffrage, resented this restriction and argued that it discriminated against the large numbers of non-white people living in South Africa. The final straw came in 1899, when the British demanded voting rights for the large number of foreign miners who had come to the Transvaal to work in the gold mines. The Boers saw this as a violation of their sovereignty and a threat to their independence. When negotiations broke down, the Boers declared war on the British on October 11, 1899. In addition to these underlying tensions, the outbreak of war was also influenced by personalities and events. The British High Commissioner in South Africa, Sir Alfred Milner, was a strong advocate of British imperial interests and saw the Boers as a threat to British dominance in the region. The Boer leaders, including Paul Kruger, the president of the South African Republic, were equally determined to protect their independence and resist British encroachment. Overall, the origins of the Boer War were complex and multifaceted, reflecting the clash of imperial ambitions, nationalistic fervor, and economic interests that characterized the late 19th century. As the war unfolded, these tensions would play out in a series of brutal battles and political maneuverings, leaving a lasting impact on South Africa and its people. Chapter 2, Early Battles and Boer Victories. The Boer War began on October 11, 1899, when the Boers declared war on the British after negotiations broke down over voting rights for foreign miners in the Transvaal. In the early stages of the conflict, the Boers enjoyed a series of victories over the British as they utilized their superior marksmanship and knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver their opponents. One of the first significant battles of the war was the Siege of Ladysmith. In late October, a Boer force under the command of General Piet Joubert surrounded the town, which was held by a British garrison of around 13,000 troops. The siege lasted for 118 days, during which time the British suffered from shortages of food and medical supplies. However, they were able to hold out thanks to the leadership of Sir George White, the British commander, and the arrival of reinforcements from other parts of South Africa. Another key battle of this period was the Battle of Spienkop, which took place on January 23, 1900. The British, led by Sir Redvers Buller, were attempting to break through Boer lines in order to relieve the siege of Ladysmith. However, they were met with fierce resistance from Boer forces under the command of General Louis Botha. The battle was marked by confusion and miscommunication on both sides, and the British suffered heavy casualties before ultimately retreating. Despite these early setbacks, the British continued to press forward. In February 1900, they launched an offensive to relieve the siege of Kimberley, which was another British-held town that had been surrounded by Boer forces. The battle for Kimberley was a hard-fought one, but ultimately the British were able to break through the Boer lines and lift the siege. However, the Boers were not done yet. In March 1900, they won a decisive victory at the Battle of Magersfontein, in which they utilized their superior marksmanship to pick off British troops from concealed positions on a hillside. The British suffered heavy casualties, and the battle was a major blow to their morale. Overall, the early battles of the Boer War were marked by a series of ups and downs for both sides. The Boers enjoyed several key victories in the early stages of the conflict, thanks to their superior knowledge of the terrain and their skill as marksmen. However, the British were able to regroup and launch counteroffensives, ultimately pushing the Boers back and lifting the sieges of several key towns. As the war continued, both sides would adapt their strategies and tactics, leading to a series of intense and bloody battles that would shape the course of the conflict. Chapter 3: The British Come Back. After a series of early setbacks, the British were determined to turn the tide of the Boer War. In the spring of 1900, they launched a major offensive to retake territory and relieve besieged towns. This period marked the turning point of the war, as the British were able to mobilize more troops and employ new tactics to gain the upper hand. One of the key battles of this period was the Battle of Paardeberg, which took place in February 1900. The Boers, led by General Piet Cronje, had entrenched themselves along the banks of the Modder River. The British, under the command of Lord Roberts, launched a surprise attack, crossing the river under cover of darkness and engaging the Boers in a fierce battle. The fighting was intense and bloody, but ultimately the British were able to prevail, capturing Cronje and several thousand of his men. This victory was a major turning point in the war, as it allowed the British to push deeper into Boer territory and relieve besieged towns. In March 1900, they were able to break the siege of Kimberley, which had been surrounded by Boer forces for several months. The relief of Kimberley was a major morale boost for the British, and it helped to turn the tide of public opinion in their favor. In May 1900, the British scored another major victory at the Battle of Belmont. The Boers, led by General Coos de la Rey, had taken up positions on a hill overlooking the British lines. However, the British were able to outflank them, attacking from an unexpected direction and driving the Boers back. The battle was a decisive victory for the British, and it allowed them to press deeper into Boer territory. The British were also employing new tactics during this period, including the use of blockhouses and concentration camps. Blockhouses were small fortifications that were constructed along railway lines and other strategic points, making it difficult for the Boers to move around undetected. Concentration camps, meanwhile, were used to intern Boer civilians, with the aim of depriving the Boers of support from the local population. These tactics were controversial, and they would later become a source of criticism for the British. However, at the time, they were seen as effective tools for winning the war. The blockhouses made it difficult for the Boers to operate, and the concentration camps deprived them of support and resources. Overall, the period of the British comeback was marked by a series of significant victories and the use of new tactics and strategies. The British were able to regroup and press forward, ultimately pushing the Boers back and breaking the siege of several key towns. As the war continued, however, the Boers would continue to fight back, leading to a series of intense and brutal battles. Chapter 4: Guerrilla Warfare. As the British continued to push deeper into Boer territory, the Boers shifted their strategy. Rather than engaging the British in pitched battles, they began to employ guerrilla tactics, launching surprise attacks and then melting away into the countryside. This period of the war, which lasted from 1900 to 1902, was marked by a series of hit-and-run attacks and ambushes, as the Boers sought to wear down the British through attrition. One of the key figures in the Boer guerrilla movement was Jan Smuts, a lawyer and military commander who had fought in the early stages of the war. Smuts recognized that the Boers could not defeat the British in a conventional battle, and he began to organize small groups of fighters who could strike at British supply lines and communication networks. Another key figure in the Boer resistance was Christian de Wet, a farmer and politician who had also fought in the early stages of the war. De Wet was a master of guerrilla tactics, and he was able to evade British forces for months at a time, launching surprise attacks and then slipping away before the British could respond. The Boers were aided in their guerrilla efforts by the rugged terrain of South Africa, which provided ample cover and hiding places. They were also able to draw on support from the local population, who were sympathetic to their cause and often provided them with food, shelter, and information about British troop movements. The British struggled to respond to the Boer guerrilla tactics. They deployed large numbers of troops and employed scorched earth tactics, burning farms and crops in an attempt to deny the Boers resources. They also erected blockhouses and fences to try to control the movement of Boer fighters. However, these efforts were often ineffective, as the Boers were able to adapt and innovate in response. They employed tactics like night raids, surprise attacks on British trains, and the use of false flags to confuse British troops. They also continued to win support from the local population, who saw them as defenders of their way of life against British imperialism. The guerrilla period of the Boer War was marked by a series of intense and brutal battles, as the Boers fought to preserve their independence and resist British rule. While they were ultimately unable to win the war, they were able to prolong the conflict and exact a heavy toll on British troops and resources. The legacy of the guerrilla period would shape South African politics and identity for decades to come. Chapter 5: InGame and Consequences. By 1902, the Boer War had dragged on for over 2 years, with both sides suffering heavy casualties and exhaustion. The British had succeeded in breaking the Boer resistance and occupying their territories, but the cost had been high. In May 1902, negotiations between the two sides began, and on May 31, 1902, the Treaty of Vereeniging was signed, ending the war. The terms of the treaty were harsh for the Boers. They were required to surrender their arms and swear allegiance to the British Crown. Their republics were annexed to the British Empire, and their territories were placed under martial law. Many Boers were sent to internment camps, where they suffered from disease and malnutrition. The end of the war had significant consequences for South Africa and its people. For the Boers, it marked the end of their independence and the beginning of a long period of subjugation under British rule. Many Boers were disillusioned with the war and bitter about their treatment at the hands of the British. Some left South Africa altogether, emigrating to other countries in search of better opportunities. For the black population of South Africa, the end of the war brought little change. They continued to be subject to discriminatory laws and policies, and their rights were not recognized by the British government. Many black South Africans had fought on both sides of the conflict, hoping that their loyalty would be rewarded with greater freedom and equality. However, these hopes were largely dashed by the end of the war. The war also had broader implications for world politics. It marked a turning point in British imperial ambitions, as the cost of the war and the criticism it generated led to a re-evaluation of British colonial policies. The war also had an impact on the future of South Africa, as it set the stage for the racial tensions and conflicts that would shape the country for much of the 20th century. Despite its high cost in lives and resources, the Boer War was a significant event in the history of South Africa and the British Empire. It represented a clash of imperial ambitions, nationalistic fervor, and economic interests, and its legacy continues to be felt today. The end of the war marked the beginning of a new era in South African history, one that would be marked by struggles for freedom, equality, and self-determination. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.